From the arena to the front office, this is Scoreboard. I'm Chris Titley, and each episode brings you stories from the game of sport, where mindset, money, and meaning shape what comes next. Athletes, coaches, owners, and business leaders unpack the moments that matter, because the Scoreboard isn't just about winning, it's about life beyond the game. Now let's get to this week's episode. Hi, it's Chris Titley here, and on today's episode of Scoreboard, the podcast, I'm joined by Pat Howard in person. Pat, thank you so much for being part of this series, and what is a glorious Brisbane morning.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, no, it was good to get the Vespa back out there this morning and get into town, and been a bit of rain around the first quarter of 25.
Yeah, how'd you go on the Vespa when it's pouring rain?
I've been caught out a couple of times, including on Saturday. I was coming back from my son's first 15 game and beautiful sunshine, then it poured. So, I got a drenching on the way back, but that's okay.
Now, Pat Howard, people will remember the name. They'll think Wallaby, they'll think cricket, lots of sport, and now you're involved in sport. Do you want to give the listeners a bit of an idea of what you're doing in sport now? Yeah,
so I'm the Executive General Manager, terribly long title, but, of strategy at the Australian... EGM, let's go with that, at the Australian Sports Commission. So... there's a part of its strategy, there's a part of its data, there's a part of its innovation. So the AIS is part of the Australian Sports Commission. Many people know the CEO, Kieran Perkins. Really good working in that new environment. You're across 100 sports. There are 100 recognised sports in this country. So, and look, we've got 3 or 4 very, very big sports. Then we've got 4 or 5 that are sort of big, half small. And then we've got another 90 that sort of only come up for 90 seconds, 2 minutes every 4 years. So it's a really interesting gig that comes across lots and lots of different environments.
I was chatting to Ron, who was the CEO of the National Pickleball League, and he was talking about the recognition of a sport. How do you get recognised as a sport?
Yeah, so there's a whole big process, and I'm absolutely across that. So you go from recognised into funding. You've got to have 3 years of financials. You've got to have, governance processes in place, a recognised registered membership and all that sort of process. So there's a big stepping stone that you work your way through. There's a funding process for both your participation and your high performance, depending on where it goes. So it's getting more transparent. That's part of my gig, part of my role. But it's really interesting to watch how the mechanisms work. And particularly for a lot of these sports, we are, as in the Sports Commission or the government, or as in the taxpayer, is 90% of their funding.
Yep.
And so how do we make that work efficiently so that, they get really good bang for your buck and can perform at Olympics or on a Commonwealth Games or a major world event and help those athletes that don't earn any money but represent their country. And as you'd appreciate, I'm pretty passionate when people are representing their country.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there an example of a sport that was recognised recently, like the last couple of years?
Well, I know, look, and this one's, esports are going through a process of trying to be recognised.
Yep.
And so, how long are their financials and working backwards and what's the role, and is it traditional gaming, which people will get the ick about, I guess. But then there's also things like you can watch people do the Zwift National Cycling Championships in front of a screen and they're powering through, and there's that digital virtual space like ergos in rowing. Think
like
about
an
it from
augmented
that
reality.
Yeah. So, getting on an ergo and racing against the person right next to you.
Yes.
So there's some really interesting ways that sport will evolve over time. Look, there are lots of sports that have gone through that process and been recognised over time or work to be recognised. Motor Racing Australia have so many memberships. Like, it's really popular, but wouldn't have even occurred to me to think of it that way. So, really passionate.
And your love of sport, done a little bit of research. Your father was a Wallaby and your grandfather was one of the all-time great Wallabies, etc., and you've all got your numbers, etc. How was it growing up being around sport and being around sport at the top level?
Yeah, so I reflect on it at Dad's funeral, which is about 10 years ago. There would have been 100 Wallabies at the funeral. So I think, it becomes normalised when you're a kid. I do remember my grandfather running at me at the backyard, and I was 8, 9 and bumping me off. And so, no, you got to get lower. and so he would have been the best part of, 75, early 70s, bumping me off, and with all the best of intentions of, mate, get lower, make sure you're right. And I remember Dad, educating me in my early, mid-15, 16, 17, he said, mate, you're not going to make it as a back probably. You're not quick enough. He was right with that. But he said, look, you'd make a really good forward. You make a really good hooker. Do you want to think about converting? So there are many blokes I play with that probably think he was right and I was wrong. But, it was a lovely environment. My uncle also, Roy Prosser, might play for the Wallabies as well. So the Cyril Towers, my grandfather, 2 daughters, they married the 2 props of Australia. So the Wallabies, so it was a incredibly Wallaby rich background. But my uncle Tim Towers was a first grade bowler with Mike Whitney at Randwick, and so there was a cricket theme as well. And I've always loved the Olympics, so representing international sport I've always loved. I love that international global contest. Look, without question, obviously comes from the family background.
Yeah, but also, I suppose, rugby as a game as a kid, how did you perceive it? Was it something you're like, oh, this is amazing, I'm a data nerd, I love it? Was it cricket? Was it other sports? I mean, how did you you think, oh, well, yes, my parents are involved in it and that's all I know, but were you sort of analysing it as well?
I didn't think I was analysing it, but I clearly was. I'm not a data nerd. I most certainly in the cricket role, I played a big data play for the simple reason that, in rugby I was a technical specialist. I know the game. I can argue that pass was good or bad or indifferent. In cricket, I was never going to win a technique conversation against, these great blokes that I used to work, Greg Chappell, Rod Marsh, just loved working with them. So I'd go to data to challenge the conversation, and they were wonderful to work with, absolutely fantastic.
I was going to say that would have been about your era as a kid growing up as sort of idolising them, huh? Or not idolising, or hero, or posters on the wall.
That 82-83 series, Australia plays Pakistan, and you've got, I remember Graham Yallop got a 268, and you've got, Chappell and Marsh and Lilly, and it was just, that. So when we all reflect back, our heroes are usually the people when we were about 10. And so we all go back, depending on what generation you're from, depends on are your heroes the Marsh, Chappell's, Lilies, or are they the Gilchrists and Haydens and Wars, or are they the next generation? And, the people that love Nathan Cleary today they're a different group that looked at his father as a fantastic player, and, you go through those different eras, and heroes aren't heroes at the start of their career. Legends aren't legends at the start of their career. I remember having this conversation in cricket and going, guys, look, on the trajectory, Steve Smith and Nathan Lyon and Mitch Stark, these guys will be legends of the game, but you're going to have to wait it out. You're going to have to wait till the end of the decade, not the start. Because on all measures, they were amazing. Their speed to 1,000 runs or 2,000 runs or, 100 wickets, or Nathan Lyon, on every plotted map of age, wickets, etc. There was Shane Warne, daylight, Nathan Lyon, daylight.
Yep.
And so you just had to bear with all that period to be able to go, look, they just need another 10 tests, and that's often the way.
Yeah. Steve Smith debuted at number 8, I think it was, as a little spinner.
Yeah.
And I watched his debut actually, and he was very tight with his batting. It was sort of like very sort of shoulders, very guarded. And you look at him now, he's just relaxed and open and wide. It's like variation from 10 years, 15 years of Test cricket.
Yeah, and look, I think from memory, he got a 77 in his second Test, batting at 7 or 8.
Yep.
And I remember talking to Greg about this, and and he'd scored 400s in the lead up to coming in, so he clearly could bat. And so and I remember sitting around a board table once, and they said, "Why don't you bowl anymore?" And Steve, like that, just went, "Because I want to be the best batsman in the world."
Wow. Okay.
And you could just see a really balanced board who often don't get clear answers, and sometimes, and it was just so clear of sense of purpose. And look, without question, in times in his career, he has been the best batsman in the world. And so And so I think, it's fascinating to watch with a decade of distance or, I love the Sam Constas thing going, he's 19. Look, the likelihood is he's going to be a very, very good player for a very long amount of time, but he'll come in and out of the team like all great players do and hopefully find his place long term. And I do feel for players these days in any sport. There is so much more media around, there's so much more questioning, and as a consequence, there is that environment where you are and exposed to a lot more commentary about yourself, and that can't be easy.
Yeah, now a couple of things I want to touch on there. Firstly, 19-year-old debut. We'll get on to your 19-year-old debut in a second. But before that, you mentioned about the sense of purpose and Steve Smith setting that big, hairy, audacious goal to be the best in the world. Did you have goals growing up? Were you a goal setter?
Yeah, I am.
Or are? Am and
yes,
are?
Yeah, I am, and I still do it, and do the. I'll give you a funny one. So when I was 40, I set 10 goals to be when I was 50. And one of them was to get my wife to every continent in the world by the time of 50.
How many are there?
So I eventually got to the 7. So
7, sorry, seven continents.
So,
10 years.
10 years. So get them, this is with 4 kids and balancing all those things. So on my birthday, turning 50, we're in Antarctica.
Oh, wow.
So I scooped in by a day. Or you could argue.
I don't think if it was a few days over, it would have been okay, I reckon. Probably.
Well, it's one of those things.
Competitive.
I'd rather reach for the stars and come up short than aim low. So, every year I put a couple of things on, and sometimes they're just stupid, different things that you want to try in a year, 100 different types of beers or, get back on the surfboard or...
So not just, anything to do with your life, really.
Yeah, because you don't... Part of this, and I say this to my staff, I go, guys, why do I like goals? It's not because we're going to stretch all the time. It's when you go back to your family at the end of the year and you go, what have you done this year? You actually can look back and go, I actually spent my time wisely. I actually I spent 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 hours a week sitting in an organisation, and you want to know you actually achieved something. You actually want to be able to say to your wife, your kids, I'm actually doing this and it's actually making a difference. So that's the bit I liked, because 1 year can roll into a next for any of us. And so I like being able to go, and here's one of the funny things, I've never got all my goals. If I aim for 5, I've got 4. If I've aimed for 10, I've got 7. And I still reflect on the 7 that I got through, not the 3 that we didn't achieve.
Yep.
So it's always been that sort of, and I can't remember when I started it. Might have been my... You do
New Year's resolution? Is that
that type of timing.
Around that time,
And it's not because, I'm going to take over the world and I'm gonna show everybody and it's going to be $1 billion and all these sorts of things. It's, I wanted to be a CEO of a listed company one day. I set that back when I was 40 and, and you only remember those goals you set 5 or 6 years. Oh, yeah, I knew I was going to try and do this. So I think... I've always enjoyed doing that, setting those goals. But I also want to be really clear. I've never got them all.
Yep.
And failure's okay.
How often do you look at them?
Probably I get back to about August or September and go, I haven't started that.
Yeah, so you're on your way. You got 4 months to go.
Yeah, no, I was yesterday we've had a part of our front yard which is... had handlebars and monkey bars and a cubby house in the front. And my youngest kid's now 17, so we had to go. And then I've gone and got some decomposed granite and started putting a matting flooring down to convert. And I'm hopeless around the house, hopeless. But I was going to get something done. So that was yesterday, digging. Getting granite out of the ute.
What does the 17-year-old want in their backyard now? Like a pool in a private area or something, or like a bar
pit.
or something?
We're doing a fire pit. We're doing a little fire pit in the front yard. Yeah. Yep. So the guys can have some beers around the bar. Beers around the uni cups.
When they're 18,
guys.
of course.
Well, this is the older boy.
Oh, yes.
So he's got a year's grace. So the younger bloke's got a year's grace, and my 2 girls will happily have a few of their mates around as well. So I've got a 21-year-old, 20-year-old, 18-year-old, 17-year-old. So people who would quickly do that.
So we've got a trampoline at our house. It still gets a bit of use for the 12-year-old. But the 10-year-old's good. The The 8-year-old's pretty good, but I reckon in a few years' time the old trampoline might have to go. It's had a good innings.
So the next iteration's the fire pit. So, but yeah, look, and it's a great place to be able to go and sit around and talk with your mates around a fire. They're not on their phones. They can have a chat, and I think that's a good thing.
And you can tell stories. TV. Yes, indeed. I'm going to go back to your rugby days early on. When did you sort of realise that you were sort of okay at rugby?
People, my mates will laugh at me. So I'm supposedly I'm incredibly confident. I think, and I've obviously give that projection. You're not. So in year 11, I was in the fifths at the start of the year. By the end of the year, I made the thirds. And 3 years later, I played.
You were 16 then, probably.
Yeah. So
16
3 years
playing
later,
fifth, 15, right?
Yeah. So I went, and 3 years later, I played for Australia.
Right.
And so, these things can change quickly. I left school. I went to university. Unlike all my mates from Ashgrove, Maris Brothers, Dan Herbert, the chairman of World Rugby.
Rugby rich school, right?
Yeah, and he and I were in the same first 15 with Richard Graham, who Australian Sevens, Graham Bond, who played for the Wallabies. That was our backline at school, and we all went different places. And so I went to university, studying pharmacy, and made Colts 1, and someone picked me as captain of Queensland 19s, a guy called Brian Trindle, gave me this huge opportunity to be captain of Queensland 19s after being the fifth 2 years before. And I don't think he knew I was 17, and it gave me an opportunity. And I didn't fear that change. I was nervous, most certainly. But so that was one of the things where you get a shot, you take it. You get another shot, you take it. And so in answer to your question, that gave me enough confidence. But look, I remember getting the call to play for Queensland when I was 19, and I thought they were ringing for the Queensland under 20
like a rep team, not the actual open team.
Open team. I said, look, I'm having a few issues with uni. I've been chucked out because of this and that, and I've missed a tour. And I said, look, I'm not available to play for the 21s. And they said, no, this is for the top team. And I went, I might have to rethink my position. So that was one of those, it's the old days of the phone. It was sitting at home. It's no mobile phones. No one's ringing mobile phones.
There wasn't a postman delivering a letter.
No.
Like your TE score or whatever it was back then.
So, no, it was and so, I played 3 games of first grade, played for Queensland, played 3 games for Queensland, played 1 Australian unis game where we got flogged by New Zealand unis, and then played for Australia. So my 7th game out of Colts was the Wallabies.
And on that game, Michael Lynagh got injured. How did you get the call again? It wasn't a mobile phone.
No, it sat on the bench
landline
for the Wallabies against Tonga. So that was Brett Johnson's played a debut game there. He and I sitting on the bench, and he gets to go on, and I'm going, geez, Tonga.
Was that because Far Jones was having a break or something? Or was injured? Or?
I think no. Well, no. Nick had retired the year before, and it was really interesting. I think because a 19-year-old was debuting, Bob Dwyer at the time did the SOS to Nick going, I want you to come back and play with and look, I've heard different versions of that story. Always appreciate, I loved playing with Nick Farr, loved playing with Peter Slattery. You always look up to those guys who were your senior guys.
Yes. Yep.
They were my heroes. My dad coached Nick and coached Slats, and Dad was part of the 91 World Cup squad, and then suddenly he's the forwards coach and his son's been picked in this team out of nowhere. And so that always has its problems as well, and very difficult for a father. I know now these days how hard it would have been for him. But he dealt with it brilliantly. He stood aside about a year later, gracefully exited.
Yeah, just a little bit too hard. Yeah.
And he was amazing like that.
And the tap on the shoulder to say you're playing in New Zealand against the All Blacks away, Bledisloe Cup, you're 19. You remember that?
I do. And this is a ridiculous thing about, Dad was always very good. He said, look, in many regards, the higher you go, the easier it gets. Because you're playing with better players. They all can do their job. I, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm still not quite sure 30 years later, I'd played New Zealand 19s, I played Queensland, New Zealand 19s, played Australian 19s on the exact same ground the year before. And it ended up being a similar result.
Yep.
New Zealand having a good win, a couple of tries to 1 or 2 that we scored, I think.
It wasn't a dominant victory. It was a close, tight victory with a couple of 10, 15 points.
Look, with the benefit of some big games over there over the years, look, it was okay, but I didn't play well in the Test match. In the 19s, I was solid enough, and there were these Neville no-names like George Gregan and Justin Marshall and Andrew Mertens and Jeff Wilson and Dan Herbert.
Jeff Wilson, the multi, the cricket rugby double.
He was unbelievable. Goldie's unbelievable. So look, these fantastic, genuinely fantastic players, and I do consider so fortunate to play in a period where I got to play with and against legends, coming up against the Lomus and the Cullens, playing with the Ealeses and the Johnsons and the, playing...
Well, in your debut game, and we'll touch on that, and I'm surprised we haven't chatted before the podcast that you hadn't actually watched your debut game.
Yeah, no, look, it's one of those things, look, you can dwell on it significantly, and I watched it. I didn't think it was going to make me play better at the time, so I sort of got on with things. We went back and played for Queensland pretty quickly. And only a year later I'd been dropped from Queensland, and so you have those. You go up quickly, you go down quickly. It's pretty humbling. I remember at the time you go to Toowong and you'd catch a lift with my mate. We'd get off the train and you didn't have any money in these days. So I've had my one test, and you hitchhike at the bus stop from Toowong roundabout to get to UQ. And we jump in the car.
Oh, you're predating Ubers here, aren't you?
Predating. So we were jumping.
A shared ride with someone you didn't know.
Yeah, and it was a really normal thing. I think people listening from that early 90s period, you get off the train at Toowong, you're trying to save money.
You might pop into Sizzler, right?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of Sizzler there. I did do a bit of buffet bashing there at the time. And but I remember this bloke going, it was, I reckon, a week later, and he's gone, geez, that bloke had a terrible debut. And it's myself and my mate Mick Heenan sitting in the back of the car, and we just let this bloke go, and he was bagging the hell out of me. Didn't know I was sitting in the back of his car, and so we got to UQ rugby fields and shake his hand on the way out, and I said, "Mate, Pat Howard, nice to meet you." And you can see the bloke, "Oh, mate, I'm really sorry."
The back truck. You put your foot in it, and you're not getting out, mate.
You're not getting out.
But I did watch that game. I watched it as a bit of research, and it was, you had Far Jones, Campese, all the greats playing that game. And it was an amateur era, by the way. You weren't paid, I don't know. Were you paid for that? No, zero. Yeah. I was going to say you might have got some food allowance or something like that. But, to run on to play and a shaky start, but you kept going, right? You were being creative. A couple of things didn't come off. Your kickoffs were a bit long and one went out. Then you tried something and it went out the full, and commentators are bagging you, but then you kept going to the point where you did lob this beautiful kick. Tim Horan just grabbed it. It was just this perfect kick, perfect grab, try time. A couple of minutes later, swing ball out to Jason Lindell, opens up the gap. Just kept going. A fearless 19-year-old. I just thought it was a really good, confident, resilient debut.
I think I didn't have a good game, and that's okay.
Yeah, and that's okay, right? And the commentators are, because you're like Michael Lyon, can't wait to get him back and all this sort of stuff, right? Yeah. But, you went out there and you're a Sam Constance, so.
Well, I think Sam Constance's debut was significantly better than mine. But I do, you have tough days.
Your head wasn't down, right?
You have tough days. You keep playing. You keep trying. I think, funnily enough, the cricket analogy, they always said, it's an unforgiving sport. And I kept saying to cricketers, look, guys, batting's an unforgiving sport. You nick off and you're gone. Bowling's an incredibly forgiving sport. You can have a terrible over and you get the guy at the end of the over and you've won the game.
And you're 1 for 18 off 1.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, look, my debut, I didn't play well. I'm really comfortable with that. I was lucky enough to play the following year and win a Bledisloe, But look, I wouldn't swap that opportunity ever again. And I would say to anybody, if you get a shot at anything, have a go. I think Tim Horan made my kick look good. It was an unbelievable take from Timmy, and he's a hilarious bloke. He often does when you're debuting, he'll say, look, geez, I'm really worried about playing with you today. Good luck, sort of. He always gives you a couple of jokes as you're going in. So I think, look, and he was a young man at the time. I think he was about 23. Jace was about 23. You had Timmy Kelleher, Paul Crowser.
Oh, yes, Timmy Kelleher, the kicker as well, yeah.
So you had...
Campo was doing a bit of kicking that game too.
He was, because I was a terrible kicker. At 19, I got better over my career and I practiced really hard at it. But, I wasn't a natural kicker. I was a runner.
Jason Little felt the Frank Bunce impact a couple of times. I remember watching that. It was a good player, Frank Bunce. The other thing on Tim Horan, there was a play in that game where I think you chipped over and went out in the full. It wasn't a big deal because you're trying to get Campo. But Tim Horan came up to you and he gave you a little tap and just like, mate, keep going. It was a really interesting moment for two young blokes playing Australia, just going, keep going.
Yeah, and look, I love playing with Timmy. I love playing against Timmy. It was one of the great, because I got Brumbies and Reds, we got to play against him a bit. Leicester and Saracens, I got to play against him a bit. It's one of these great things to get to play with legends. Look, and I'm very comfortable. Timmy, if not the greatest 12 of all time, one of the great 12s. And I also, Jason and all, Danny Herb and these guys, I'm so fortunate to play with great
Campo
players.
on the wing.
Oh, Campo was unbelievable. The following year we played against Samoa, and David Knox was the 10, and so you had. I'll be happy to say Knoxie and Campo's their favourite pastime's not tackling, but this unbelievably skillful, found space. Campo would pop in at 10 and distribute and find, and it was just, sometimes you are on the field with players and you just go, what an honour it is to be out there.
Yep.
I remember playing with Steve Larkham when he was not Steve Larkham, and you're just going, oh my God. So these are the things you are fortunate enough to do in your life. You play with people that are legends before they're legends, and sometimes it's not hard to see. Sometimes people surprise you. That debut, we all have bad games in life. Without question, that was I think it was my poorest test. Many might be able to go through the archives and find other ones. But I also think I learnt a lot. I went, right, geez, I've got to become a better kicker. I've got to understand I can't just attack at all costs. I just can't take bunts on one-on-one.
Sam Constance.
And you learn these things.
Yep.
And you find different ways.
Reading the game a bit more, as it's been more sort of, not so conservative, but more reading the game, I suppose. Let's try this, try that. Maybe we don't try that then, we'll try it a bit later.
You learn.
Yep.
You absolutely learn. Our neighbour across the row is Huey Weidman. So Huey's the captain.
It's been on the podcast, by the way, on the Scoreboard podcast. Yeah.
Huey took my daughter to his formal. He lives across the road. Love Huey. Great fella. Known him since he was a tiny kid. And so, he said, look, Constance, we'll play like this. We're in the Under-19 World Cup. We're the world champions.
Huey was captain.
Yeah, Huey was captain.
Yep.
And so they'll do a great. But it's really interesting. You adapt over time. You adapt your style. You learn from your experiences a lot of the time as much as you learn from coaching.
Interestingly, Hugh is of the era of, he was 6 when the Big Bash started. So it's 14 years. I think he's 20 now. That he's had his whole youth of all forms of the game. He's probably the first Australian generation to do that. There's been people that have been halfway in, halfway out, and whatnot. And it's I asked him the question about how do you prepare now as a kid? Like, what were you doing when you're 8? Were you doing reverse sweeps and probably not ramps back then, but sort of being creative? And it's a different era of playing cricket now as a child. He's the first sort of generation. Going back to you played in an amateur era, and then professionalism came in 95. How did you find that?
I consider it the people of my generation So I'm born in 73 and a lot of great players are born around my time. We were fortunate enough, lucky enough to play amateur rugby, and then someone was willing to pay us to do what we love to do and would have done anyway. That was just unbelievable, you know. And it wasn't a fortune. I earned, and to temper kids that think it's all about the money, look, I earned, my wages past playing were far more than anything I earned in playing.
Yep.
I was lucky enough. You know,
I mean, you could adjust deflation a little bit, but still nowhere near as probably what you passed your career. Yeah,
that's right. And you know, I studied my whole way through playing. I collected a couple of degrees as I went through. So by the time I'd finished, I had 4 or 5 qualifications, and no experience, mind you. But I think it gave me that grounding to get it. You know, Dad was very strong. You know, until you get your piece of paper. Whatever that piece of paper is, then you're under my remit. After that, mate, you're on your own. You're on your own. So I think, you know, when the game went professional, in 95, there was all the shamateurism stuff, the marketing contracts and all that sort of stuff. So that sort of, and I was on one of the lower tier stuff, which was fine. The following year, the opportunity came. Rob McQueen came and spoke to me when I was playing for the Wallabies, and he said, look, because I was in the Wallabies squad and I couldn't make the Queensland team. And I was caught between those two.
Right, okay. That's an interesting... I mean, you see some cricketers these days sort of do that or other players going, hold on a second, I probably can't make your state, but you're in the squad, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so I looked, and that's where... And this is probably my big move. Your first move is often your hardest. Your first time you go and really push yourself in comfort zone. And so I moved from Queensland to the Brumbies. Rod, who, only with the benefit of hindsight, was such an innovator. You know, he wasn't technical. But his man management, his ability to go and push the boundaries made us all study harder. The Brumbies were formed. We couldn't be the biggest. We couldn't be the strongest. So we had to be the smartest. And so we, you know, so many people that have come out of that environment, the Ewan McKenzies, David Giffins, Brett Robinsons.
I remember that. Was it Dan Crowley, undercover cop?
Undercover cop. So Crowles was up here at the time, but he
Cameron Lillycrap was a physio, I remember that.
Yeah, there was a lot of it. So there are a lot of people who studied during the, you know, Brett's a doctor.
I remember in that test we were talking about, they had the occupation flash up and Campo was a PR consultant and you would have been a pharmacy student, I reckon, is that right?
Oh, it's, you know, I think.
Occupation pharmacy student.
Yeah, occupation pharmacy student. So we all had our pieces of paper, and I think as a consequence, you know, Jason Little is the CEO of Goodman Australia. You know, these people...
John Eels is on multiple boards of ASX-listed. Yeah,
you know, you go through them all. Rob McCrawl's been incredibly successful.
Yep.
You know, these guys have done incredible things post-playing. And I do think because they had the grounding and they had to work, and I used to have to work at a pharmacy, Della Hunty's day and night pharmacy on Albert Street when I first got out. And, you know, you'd work all day, you'd train in the morning, you'd work all day. You go to training at 6 o'clock that night. You would finish at 8:30. You go home and I was living with my mate Mick Heenan, who's a coach at Bond Uni down here, and we'd make a terrible dinner and we'd rinse and repeat.
Yep.
Or we'd happen to pop over to people's places on a Saturday or Sunday for a different, you know, because so many mothers were making
getting a free
dinners. Free feed. Just conveniently turn up at 6 p.m.
with a bag of washing too.
Exactly. So it. You know, Mum and Dad were living down the coast, and we grew up in sort of Sideshow Alley, so they were out. They were travelling around a lot. So we were on our own, and it was like every period of 17, 18, 19, those couple of years out of school, you're finding yourself and you're having a great time, and it was awesome.
Your rugby career also took you over to the UK, and again, like a different phase of your life, moving over there and playing over there and then eventually coaching over there. Do you want to talk about that experience?
Yeah, so look, I you know, I could see I toured in 97 and we had a Wallaby tour of Argentina, England and Scotland. And so I could see a little bit like most of my life, I've always been a little bit of a rush. So I was 23, so I played my last test day after I turned 24.
Right, so 4 years, 20 test matches.
Yeah.
And then that was
it. So and so I went to Leicester as a relatively young, it wasn't a end of my career move.
No, you're 23 in the UK.
But I turned up at Leicester and Leicester had come off a poor season. Bob Dwyer had been sacked, coincidentally, but he wasn't the guy that brought me in. And once again, they didn't really have a backs culture, so I got to play with Joel Stransky, who had, won the World Cup with South Africa only a couple of years before. You're playing with Martin Johnson, who, had led the Lions a little bit ago with a couple of Neil Back.
Legends before legends.
Legends before legends. And I consider that being a really consistent part of my career. You get to see these people that become legends.
Isn't it a good feeling, though, the prosperity around
It's amazing.
Yeah.
The
dopamine hit to watch someone and in anything in life, watch kids grow up and watch sports does, watch your stock market go up, anything, right?
Yeah, look, and to be calm when everyone else is panicking. And I've used this in a little bit in business, and I think sport teaches you this you don't win every game. You're not going to win every game at the start of the season. You've got to be calm when you lose a game here or there. I think great coaches have got that a great ability to, okay, we've lost 2 or 3 in a row. Is the process going well? I remember Chris Fagan did this interview with the coach of the Suns at the time, and they'd both come last and second last. And they had 2 very different views of their season. One, Fagan was talking about the process and it's improving and I can see the growth. And the other coach at the time was, it's all terrible and it's all, and your ability to see the potential and be calm when everyone else is panicking is really important.
And he had a consistent message for 5 or 6 years after most losses. You watched the press conferences with Fagan and it was all the same message. And it got to a point where the press were going, mate, you got to harden up. Like, they lost. He's like, well, are they going to teach them how to kick straight at training? He's like, mate, they know how to kick straight at training. They just didn't kick straight today. We know the process. They'll kick straight eventually. And look what happened.
They do.
And come the finals, they couldn't miss.
And you're right. And the similarities in sports across, you've got to find, and I go the other way, when everyone else is being calm, panic. So
it's a good point. Yeah,
you've got to be able to, everything is rosy or everything is terrible, and the truth is somewhere in between.
Yep.
And so I think trying to balance out your, to be able to see a month ahead, 2 months ahead, because whoever wins the grand final in any sport this year will not be undefeated. They will have a loss here, there, or somewhere. They'll have a bad game.
Yep.
And they'll probably have 5 or 6 bad games. In baseball, the best teams usually lose 60 games out of their 160 in a year.
Yep.
Your ability to deal with the bad games, deal with the down bit, being able to keep your team up and find the positives is incredibly important. Leicester we had good games and bad games, but it was fantastic to take a very forward-based team and take them into a rounded attacking type style, but also learn from them. This was the best mauling team in the world. When mauling was a bit harder,
yep.
You weren't allowed to bring down the maul. I hope listeners,
the rules have changed.
The rules have changed, and so I learned to appreciate how to close games out in England on a wet and muddy day. How do you win games that are difficult? And you learn that sometimes in New Zealand, in the South Island, and you learn it in Europe as well. So it was a fantastic experience, going back to actually your original question, where Chris.
That's right. Yeah, the UK.
UK.
We've digressed. We digress a lot.
We digress a bit. We digress. So it was, I'd gone from the Brumbies culture, which was about finding competitive advantage and intellect, and the Rod Kafers and
strategy. Really strong strategy.
Strategy, and it was fantastic. And then I went to a different culture, which was hard.
Rainy, cold, miserable. I mean, Canberra can't get that way, but certainly the rugby's different over there in terms of the style.
Even that, Leicester's different.
Yep.
So Leicester is a working class team. And I remember cheating as I normally do in a game of touch, and I got belted and I got opened up with 6 stitches, and that was Tuesday training, and you were still back out there for the afternoon session. That wasn't the Brumbies. But what I got to appreciate is that it's not necessarily what type of culture you have, but if you have one, What is your point of difference? You're allowed.
So identifying the fact that you've got one and what it is, as opposed to trying to work out what it is or change it. If you don't have something, it's hard to change if you don't know what it is.
And they were hard. They were tough. And I learned that worked for them. You go and play in France, and it's a whole different, and all the theories on sports science in France were completely different from what I was used to, and for some reason it worked. And so learning about different environments, be it the Brumbies, be it the Reds, be it playing in Leicester, playing in France, getting involved with cricket, you've seen different ways to play. And I remember having this conversation in the cricket days. There are different styles. Victoria and New South Wales have very, very different styles in the way they played their cricket over the years. And both have their strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
But as long as everybody buys in, it's incredibly engaging and successful if you can get people behind them.
So these lessons that you've learned as a growing up, obviously, and then getting picked and playing for Queensland, playing for the Wallabies, then going over to the UK, playing for Leicester, then to turn to becoming a coach. How did the lens change as a coach from a player?
Well, I think I was a coach from 30 to 33. So I was
very young.
I was a young coach, very, very young. And to a certain extent, I learnt more from coaching than I did from any MBA or any of the qualifications that I've done. I took bits and pieces of things that worked. Because I was younger than 5 or 6 of my players, I listened to them significantly and going, right, if my messaging wasn't clear, they'd say, look, tell me what you actually want me to do. Stop overcomplicating things. So it was a very collaborative effort. My assistant coach was the perfect foil for me, a guy called Richard Cockerell, who was a hard man of English rugby and who's a hard coach, and he still coaches today. He's the head coach of Georgia. And it was just a fantastic environment where he was 33 or 4, I was 30. We were having to come to the end of 6 or 7 Lions or World Cup winners. Martin Johnson was ending, Neil Back, Graham Roundtree, these wonderful players. So, and you had to transition from Martin Johnson to another England captain called Martin Corrie, great mate of mine. So I think, it was an incredible experience, so positive. You had to learn to drop your mates. You had to learn to exit your mates. Still today, whilst I think incredibly highly of them, I know that that's hard on them today still. And so that's a difficult thing you have to go through, and you've got to try and be consistent. But I stole an idea from Greg Smith, who was a Wallaby coach, and Greg, only with the benefit of hindsight, had a brain cancer while he was coaching the Wallabies. So, but he had some real positives and negatives the way he went about things. But he often picked and dropped people in the same room, so you would. And it was a great way of being. You had a witness to every conversation, and you had to be absolutely think about what you're saying to the person being dropped. You had to think about what you're saying to the person that's being picked. You couldn't lie. You had to be very clear with your messaging. And you also had to give hope to the person that's been dropped. And you also had to say to the person that's coming in, well, this is not a job. You're not in there forever. And so I think you take bits and pieces from all these coaches that you've had over time, the stuff that worked for you, the stuff that didn't work for you. And but I loved coaching. It was a fantastic job, and I loved it. But I think 4 kids under 4.5, probably. My wife said, "Well, we're going to stay put somewhere. Where do you want that to be?" And I went, "Well, I can't guarantee it's always going to be in Leicester as 20 years as a coach." We had to find a new base.
From coaching, and there's a lot of similarities what you're talking about in terms of business, about potentially letting go of staff and making the hard decisions and all that sort of stuff. Very similar line there. But from coaching to not really coaching, but sort of coaching in the high performance role with Cricket Australia, you're sort of somewhere in between, right?
Yeah,
with the players and the coach and the board and all these stakeholders now. You've gone from being accountable as the coach to now going, well, I'm sort of sitting in the middle, but at the highest, but I'm not. But how do you go there?
Yeah, and look, so the career went, funnily enough, I went from coaching Leicester, had a high performance for Rugby Australia.
Oh yes, okay, yep.
And then
you came
I
back.
missed the birth of my fourth kid, so I had to say to John O'Neill at the time, look, man, I'm really sorry. This
There's
ain't
a
gonna
priority
work.
here.
I can't keep going to Sydney, and so then I was Chief Operations Officer of Cromwell.
That's right,
Big
Brisbane-based group. I remember
literally
you
across the road here.
popped into my old employer Morgan's a couple of times with a couple of presentations.
Yeah,
I seem to remember.
so-
Paul Waitman.
And Paul Waitman was my boss, so I thank him very much, and Darryl Wilson, who was the CFO. So wonderful experience again, working in property in the middle of the GFC, and once again, you learn from every experience that you go through. And then I had sort of 3.5 years in that role, and then the cricket role come out. And most certainly it wasn't high performance roles aren't tracksuit roles. You've got to be able to walk into a change room and be able to speak the lingo in a change room. You've also got to be able to walk into a boardroom and speak the lingo of a boardroom. And so I think
Changing hat and being empathetic and understanding other people's kind of like views, players versus coach versus board versus head of marketing.
Absolutely. You have, for the listeners, this is an interesting understanding. So the players today are told, you've got to get out there and get your brand out there, and you've got to be, accessible. And that's one meeting. The next meeting is the integrity guy walks in and goes, well, you can't say anything, and you can't. And so these poor guys are actually caught between, guys and girls, are caught between a rock and a hard place, because they've got to be able to go out there and build your brand and say something controversial, but please don't say anything controversial.
Yeah, I'm enjoying a coffee this morning. They go, do you realise the rival coffee brand sponsoring? Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Oh my God. So
I'm having a burger at Hungry Jack's. Can't do that because Mac has sponsored the comp. Oh, sorry.
No, so look, it was a fascinating role. You'd have to play with the players' union, collective bargaining agreements. And these are multi-million-dollar deals. I remember the last collective bargaining agreement I was involved with went up to $440 million over. Right. So these are big numbers. These are big deals. And, you've got to be able to find. It's not like you can negotiate with, sorry, I'm not going to deal with the Cricketers Association. I'm going to go and deal with the Baseball Association. It's not like that. Yeah. It's a one-on-one conversation where you can go and find a standard place. So I think it was a fascinating role. I thank James Sutherland for taking, and Wally Edwards for taking me on, because it was a high risk play for them to take on a non-cricketer. And, I love that role. I love working with all the captains I got to work with, male and female. Big bash, women's big bash.
Yeah, the development of the
cricket.
women's sport is from look back now, from when you started to where it is now. You must be, pretty proud as well.
Well, absolutely, and it's fascinating. It was off the back of a really dominant period. Ricky Ponting's Test team was unbelievable, but cricket was about the 6th or 7th most played sport. It had dropped right down, and so this concept that winning always creates greater participation. That correlation isn't right. And so, building high performance that actually leads into making sure kids play sport is actually having a great narrative, a great story. People understand the sport. People love to see themselves in the sport, and that it's a sport that mums and dads can get into, but also their kids and mates can get into. I remember the great story Lise Perry said to me when we were dealing with, she said, look, particularly with boys, it seems to me that boys have got to win to get on, but she said a lot of the time girls have got to be able to get on to win. And that concept of, for girls to be playing participation sports, they want to go and play with their friends and then go and play. And then blokes, well, often they'll go into a club to go and meet mates to go and play. So there's this wonderful learnings of dealing with both the male and female cricket team that was fascinating, incredibly enjoyable, seeing legends across the board. That development of that women's team was incredible during that period. And look, it was just a great job, and I only sit back on it and reflect on it positively.
I'm going to touch on participation. You talked on that just a little bit about participation numbers, and it's very fascinating to see every year is different in terms of what sports are growing and what's not at a grassroots level. But there seems to me, and as a parent, my oldest is 12, but there seems to be a little bit of specialisation in sport at the moment. The kids are going a bit earlier because of the potential pathway to become a bit more rich and famous and also become a high-performing athlete, etc. I'm keen to understand your views of balancing, high performance of a particular sport. Let's say you're in the Queensland team or representative team for cricket at the age of 12 versus playing lots of sports and getting out there.
Yeah, look, I'm a very anti-specialisation person. And look, I go to the Jordan Spieth, the golfer, years ago, who he was told to specialise very, very early. Went in and he was playing gridiron and basketball and baseball, and he played lots of different sports. And the data in the US, specialisation doesn't work. They've done a lot of regressional analysis there. There are some exceptions in some sports, but overall, particularly some of those big team sports, don't specialise. Kids, go and play as many sports as you can. Go and sample different sorts. The likelihood is you're not going to be elite, and we'd rather you have a good time. I love that Norway is a really interesting country where they play effectively most of the sport is in school level is free and it's run by the government. Very rich country, obviously. But they don't necessarily have a big focus on high performance, yet let alone without that. They still, with a population of a couple of million, 4 or 5 million people, they still are always at the top or near the top of the Winter Olympics. They've still got one of the greatest strikers in the world. They've got a golfer in the top 10. They're incredibly relatively competitive in Summer Olympics for their size, and they don't really focus on high performance, actually just getting people into sport and then choose the sport you love. They do specialise at the pointy end post a certain age. So I think, we are the only country except Ireland that has 4 professional football codes. And so I think there is very much that competition, and I genuinely don't think it's a good thing. The amount of I'd much rather us not have all these rep teams at these junior age groups, and kids just love playing because I've seen more kids disappointed with slightly missing out on this team and slightly missing out on that team, which effectively turns them off. I had some old data around, even the AFL draft and those that hadn't been picked up and not playing sport 2 or 3 years later. These would be unbelievable. They could be at the Brisbane 2032 doing a different sport in a different place. And so I'd love us as a nation to work together to keep people in sport. There are lots of different sports out there, and the specialisation is not a good thing. What drives specialisation is not the players. It's usually not the parents. It's often the professionalisation of coaching and going, well, I've got to keep coaches in a job and at these younger age groups, and you have to choose now. You don't have to choose. Keep playing both your sports. Parents, if your kids love 4 sports, keep them playing 4 sports. If they love 2 sports, keep them loving 2 sports. And it'll actually help out, and eventually you'll find your sport. So, and to be honest, the majority of people, the greatest benefit of playing most of these sports is the discipline that you can take into working in an office that we're sitting in today and playing your team sport, and because that's where 99% of people will end up. Your likelihood is you won't be a professional or represent your country, but my God, it's great fun trying. It's great fun having a go and being the best version of yourself you can be.
Sport's given so much to you. I'm interested. I do this little thing called the Scoreboard moment, where it's one moment, or it's like a Kodak moment, where you can visually remember it, and it's sort of changed or altered the course of your career.
Yeah, thanks. And I had this conversation. A couple of my mates were having a beer at Rosalie, and who are you grateful for in your life? So
it's a good thing for kids to go through too. Yeah,
so we had this conversation. So I picked a guy called Brian Trendle with my mates. This is my Ashgrove Barras Brothers mates sitting around having a chat, and because he picked me in the Queensland under-19 team as a captain.
You mentioned that earlier in the podcast.
So that story. So when there wasn't really any reason to do that. And so I think that was, but
Yeah. There's been so many.
Sutherland. I remember sitting on the old days. It was called the TAS 1 and 2. This is probably a lucky moment rather than being thankful to somebody. But so we played the first 15 year in 1990. I don't know, many of your listeners weren't born then, so that's fine.
Surprisingly, our audience is in the 35 to 50 category, so some might be.
Some might be. So, they picked the TAS 1 team, so this is the combined team. I didn't make that one. Brendan Cannon was in that team. Richard Graham was in that. I didn't make that team. There was a TAS 2 team. I didn't make that one either.
So you didn't make the TAS 1 or TAS 2 team?
Wasn't good enough
as a first 15 player.
But they picked 6 guys to sit on a bench in case someone got injured the day before. So I was sitting on that. David Giffen was sitting on that with me. I think Graham Bond, who played for the Wallabies, was sitting on that bench. And a couple of guys didn't turn up, got injured. So I ended up playing for the TAS 1 team. From that, got picked in the Queensland schoolboys second team and got to go on a trip. And those sliding door moments where you go, oh, right, I'm now going. I'll go and take that shot. And I didn't make any of the Queensland 15s or 16s or any of those teams. I wasn't even close. I played in the 13Bs. So I think, those pivotal
that
moments.
Bench, the TAS2 bench moment as sliding doors.
It was a sliding doors moment.
Up you go, well, not bench two, but bench in the whole group, and they're like, on you go, son. You're on the ones now.
Yeah, and look, and maybe it was a. I do think going to University Colts the following year probably it did help. My mother was the assistant coach of that team, so I reckon I might have got a run, but that probably gave you some confidence to go. Well, no one's that good and no one's that bad, and the difference isn't huge, and so it was probably in terms of my rugby opportunity and giving me some faith that it's possible and things can change quickly. That's probably that pivotal moment. But I've got to say, every decade I could point to a thing in my life where I've gone, that person didn't have to do that for me. A guy called David Usaz has vouched for me for twice to get into different corporate roles.
Yep.
And
I was fortunate to meet David in 2017 at the Warren Buffett Omaha convention, which just happened recently. Obviously, with Warren retiring, I was fortunate to go 8 years ago today, and David shared a minivan with him on a site tour, so it was a good little chat.
Oh, Brisbane is amazing. And so look, and so I'm incredibly grateful to these people. So this is when you get a chance to. If someone says, "Oh, can I have a coffee with you?" Sure, great, happy to, because you get to sit back and have those conversations with people and hopefully link one person to another person that might be able to get someone else, and suddenly they get their pivotal moment. And you like being able to see people go through that as well, and then start watching your children go through those pivotal moments as well.
Pat, I'm going to finish with 2 questions. One is your all-time favourite sporting moment, which includes yourself. And the other question is your all-time favourite sporting moment that doesn't include yourself.
Okay. So I'll go my one. So it was and not in Australia because a little bit out of the distance, but I was sort of player coach of the Leicester team against Stade Francais in 2001. Coming home.
Player coach. I mean, I've interviewed Cal Bruton. He was player coach as well. There's a thing you don't talk about anymore.
Yeah, no. And look, I was 26. It was amazing, and that could have been a pivotal moment because it took me into coaching full time 4 years later, wherever it was. So, there are so many things in all our lives that get you to reflect on these things. I think so. That was my last game. We scored 3 tries to 0 and won the game 34-30.
Right, what a cracking game!
It was. It is still. It was an unbelievable game. Fantastic game to watch, and was last game, and so we had 10,000 Leicester supporters there in the corner as I was leaving, singing Waltzing Matilda. So we're in the middle of Paris. We've beaten Stade Francais, effectively on their home turf, and you got 10,000 people singing Waltzing Matilda, and I was the only Australian. John Connolly was he was the head coach. So we'd won the game.
But
so
still, this deep connection back to your youth, back to where you came from, all these hard works, the rainy days, the rainy days playing for the Wallabies, etc. You're in the other side of the world where rugby is huge. You're the opposition. It's only 10,000 of you against, 50-odd thousand?
Yeah.
And they're singing out because of you.
Yeah, and so that was a really special moment. My wife was there to enjoy that moment as well. So I think, that was incredibly important. Well, sorry, it wasn't important. It was just lovely.
Yeah.
It was lovely.
Yep.
I think, talking about ones that I wasn't involved with, I'll go to one that I'm sitting up with my mate Hino watching the 91 World Cup. And these, I reckon it's 2 a.m. or something.
From Twickenham.
At Twickenham. So this is the quarterfinal. In Australia,
Ireland
quarterfinal. And because Dad's the assistant coach, and so the lead into the game at the end, Gordon Hamilton from Ireland scores a try in the far corner. Australia looks like they're out of the World Cup. They're gone. And then Michael Liner, for those listeners, Tom Liner's dad.
Yes, that's right. We have to preface that. I had, that's right. You realise you're a little old when you start talking about, I played cricket with his dad.
Yeah, Tom Liner and Louis Liner's dad. So, and so I think, and so Michael takes charge, kicks at the corner together, and then Slattery hits Liner, hits Horan. I think he hits Jace. Jace gets a ball away to Marty Roebuck, who gets a ball to Campo,
with his socks
back,
down,
something like that. And then Campo flicks it up to Noddy in the corner.
That little pop pass,
And a crowd of, let's say it's 50 or 60,000 in Dublin just goes silent. And it was just...
I remember the commentary. You can hear a pin drop. They go stunned. The commentator's stunned as well. It's like, and the Australians are sort of like they're high-fiving, etc.
It was unbelievable.
What just happened?
So, look, I'm going to the archives there and probably showing my age, but once again, you reflect on, I could easily have gone to the 2015 World Cup when Mitch Stark, bowls McCullum on the third ball.
At the G.
I was sort of involved in that, and so I excluded that one because of your commentary. But so many great things. Sport, I'm not as a fan of sport as much as I'm an analyst of sport. I don't support a team per se. I don't.
You haven't got the tattoo on the arm of a particular team. No.
Look, I love, I enjoy watching the business of sport. I like being contrarian to have a look at how sports can improve. We have got a very funny system in Australia where there are 4 big sports, and how do we make sure that we have got the next, the best swimmers coming through, or the best
runners, or whatever,
polo players, or runners, or
rowers, and
they're not
Yep.
Disenfranchised because they didn't make a junior team in some other sport that they're not probably not quite right for. So I do believe in that, and I believe that's a really good place for the AIS and Sports Commission to work with the whole of sport. But I still find, I'll finish on this last bit. My last Saturday was I coached 4th grade at uni with about 9 mates that I played Colts 1 with. So I think we've nearly got more coaches than we do players. It's a great chance just to get together and meet up with mates. I went to 4th grade. Then I had a son that played in Colts 1. Then I went back for another son that played in the Morris First 15. And then I went back and watched another game after that. And I got to the end of Saturday and sort of went, well, I've watched 4 games. They're all absolutely fantastic games. I got to see people that were over the moon, the people that were disappointed. They had emotion. They experienced all of that. And so sport is still an incredibly strong part of my life. My mother who coaches 5th grade at uni. If anyone wants to understand who the old lady is wandering around uni, she's now been coaching unbroken for about 30 years.
Including yourself, you mentioned earlier.
Mum's coached me. She coached many Wallabies. I've asked this question speaking at lunches, who's been coached by my mother? And you don't even have to phrase who it is, and she puts her hand,
Yeah, the crowd puts
you'll
their
get
hand up.
30% of the
scattering of, or no,
people
more than a
standing.
scattering, yeah.
So, look, I haven't been able to escape it. I'm glad I haven't been able to escape it. And look, it's been an incredibly awesome experience being involved from 12-year-olds playing for the 13Bs to, running strategy at the Sports Commission today. It's been incredibly enjoyable 40 years from those 2 points. And so I consider myself incredibly lucky.
Pat Howard, thank you so much for being on Scoreboard today to give a bit of an insight into your life and your involvement with sport, your love, your deep passion for sport, your continued deep passion for sport. I wish you all the best to the next phase of your life and the role at the ASC and continuing to get people to play sport, and looking forward to catching up.
Thanks, Chris. Cheers, mate.